Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, February 19th, day 502 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Amanda. Good to be with you.
Always good to see you. All 6 remaining living hostages slated to be released in the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal will be freed on Saturday, Israeli and Hamas officials said yesterday. We'll delve into what's behind this change in plan. Former White House Mideast czar, Brett McGurk, set the record straight this week on Hamas's intransience during the drawn-out negotiations that eventually resulted in this phased ceasefire hostage release deal. We'll hear what he had to say. And we'll learn about allegations against Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey from Israel's new U.S. ambassador. All this and much, much more when we're back. In a surprise move reportedly linked to growing worries that the ceasefire and captive release deal in the Gaza Strip could collapse, 6 living hostages will be released on Saturday, including Israelis who have been in the Strip for a decade. The other 4, Tal Shoham, Omer Shem-Tov, Omer Wenkert, and Eliya Cohen, were kidnapped during the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack on southern Israel. These men represent what is believed to be the final living hostages included in the phase 1 of the ceasefire deal. Now, Jacob, what do you know about why these 6 are being released in one go versus the agreed upon 3 that were set to be released on Saturday?
So what I can tell you is that it seems like there's some concern from both sides, Israel and Hamas, that we're not going to reach the end of this stage without things being shaken up in some form. And what we actually saw over the past few days was Hamas be the one to offer this early release for 3 of the hostages who would have instead been released the following weekend. The idea is to have all 6 of them at once. Basically, my understanding, speaking to an Arab mediator, was that Hamas is really intent on getting 47 prisoners that were released in the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap in 2011 that were then rearrested by Israel. And these are very symbolic in Hamas's mind. These have been prisoners that Hamas has been trying to get back for quite some time, even before October 7th. And there's concern that if the deal collapses before the end of the first phase, that these, according to the terms as they are, these 47 prisoners are not supposed to be released until either at some point up to the 42nd day. So there was a lot of concern that Israel would hold on to these 47. So Hamas is instead giving an offer to Israel to say, look, we'll give you your 6 hostages that you are expecting to see released early on right now. And then we'll get our 47 prisoners as well. And maybe that will also demonstrate momentum. Interestingly, Hamas issued a statement about this decision to release these 6 hostages in English and in Hebrew. My understanding, speaking to their mediator again, was that this was an attempt by Hamas to demonstrate seriousness regarding its willingness to negotiate the terms of the phase 2 of the deal, because obviously Hamas is just looking to survive at this point, and the phase 2 really gives them the opportunity to do so. And there's obviously the political difficulties on the Israeli side, but that's, I think, the backdrop for what we saw allow us to get to this point where we're seeing more hostages come home earlier than we thought.
I wonder, Jacob, you mentioned just offhand that they're trying to survive, that Hamas is trying to survive. And don't you think that the emphasis in releasing these prisoners in one go is more on that versus the symbolic nature of the security prisoners that, yes, were released during Gilad Shalit prisoner release deal, but then re-imprisoned later? That seems very symbolic. And right now it seems to me that Hamas is just fighting for its political survival, especially with the different approach that the Trump administration seems to be taking versus this phase deal that the Biden administration negotiated for. The Trump administration, Trump himself, and of course his Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, is taking a much different stance. So talk to us about this different stance.
Sure. So I think what we're seeing, if you could summarize it, I spoke with an analyst who put it this way to me, Joel Baronald, and he basically put it as a swap where you had in the Biden administration, the emphasis was on principles. If you remember, towards the beginning of the war, you had what was called the Tokyo Principles that were issued by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who talked about the various notions of that what the U.S. was willing to accept regarding the day after in Gaza. It was maybe Israel was not going to be able to be taking over extra territory in Gaza, that it wouldn't be occupied by Israel. Various principles that were put forward in Tokyo at the time. The Trump administration's approach, and specifically Steve Witkoff, is to not talk about principles as much. Put aside the details, get the parties themselves can try to negotiate those. Instead, what we want to really buy into is just having a process. And that's what I think we're seeing real success from the Witkoff approach of getting both Israel and Hamas to at least buy in to this process. Now, it doesn't mean that the process is going to look like it necessarily did in the deal that was put forward. Like, we're already seeing a collapse of the first phase of the deal, and the second phase is likely going to look different. But the idea is to at least try to get the sides to the table and to start negotiating, which seemed quite difficult and almost impossible at points. We had various breakdowns where Hamas issued its threat last week or a couple weeks ago, saying it wasn't going to release hostages, and Israel was making certain violations in terms of not releasing or not allowing in certain equipment in. But yet they were able to overcome those issues because I think the focus wasn't on necessarily details. And you saw, as you mentioned, you talked about the pressure that Hamas is now feeling from the Arab parties, that it cannot any longer remain, at least in political power in Gaza. That is something that there's more emphasis on, and that pressure is a result of the Trump administration's approach, and Witkoff too, where you had Trump talk about his Gaza takeover plan, and that put this existential threat for Egypt, that's the way they see it, the possibility of having all these Palestinians move into Egypt. And as a result, now you're seeing Egypt take a harder line. You're seeing the Arab League head issue a statement talking about the notion that Hamas needs to step down. So that's a shift because of the Trump administration's leaning on the Arab parties that are now in response leaning on Hamas. And then on the other hand, you have this other sort of pressure on Israel, which is not trying to get Israel to necessarily agree to specific details. It recognizes that the political limitations of Netanyahu's government are very small, and therefore they can't really talk about any of these day after plans, and they're just leaving it to the U.S. to decide. But they are pushing Israel at the same time to agree to start these negotiations on phase 2, which is something that you could see Netanyahu didn't necessarily want to do. And according to a U.S. official I spoke with, it did require pressure from the U.S. when it was Marco Rubio and Witkoff were in town recently, or in conversations with Netanyahu and pushing at it. And it just became something that they agreed to once Witkoff publicly said, this is what we're going to be doing. He was speaking at a rally in Miami, and he's talked about this plan to really move forward and start phase 2. It's not a question of if, it's when at this point. And that this dual, I think this triangulated, I guess you could say, pressure approach, while also still giving Israel the space it needs to not necessarily agree to terms yet. I think, again, this broader idea of process over principles. And for now, it seems to work. Obviously, we're getting to the harder part moving forward.
So with all of that context, it makes sense that we're hearing reports that Hamas has submitted an offer to Israel to release all the hostages at once in phase 2, rather than spreading them out as we have seen in phase 1. The offer was, of course, as I mentioned earlier, made so that Hamas can remain in some kind of power, and it's prioritizing its own survival over security prisoners, which we just discussed. But alongside this, I have to wonder, Jacob, tomorrow we're going to see the return of 4 bodies of Israelis who were taken hostage, either alive or dead, on October 7th. Among them could be, we don't know yet, the bodies of Shiri Bibas and her 2 young boys, Ariel and Kfir. And I just wonder how this will shift just the whole mood of any kind of possibility for negotiations. Again, nothing is confirmed yet. Until we receive the bodies back tomorrow, on Thursday, the 4 bodies, we don't know the identity of these people, and their identity will be confirmed at Abu Kabir, the Forensics Institute, later on in the day. So, Jacob, how do you see this? I don't know, they've become more than a symbol. They've become just the heart of every thinking, feeling person who cares about Israel, the Bibas family. How do you see this shifting in any kind of way, the negotiations?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on this. I think what I've noticed speaking the differences in conversations between Israelis and those abroad is, at least amongst Israelis, there seems to be a little bit less optimism regarding this case. The tragedy is there regardless of how hopeful you are of whether or not they're going to come back alive. But I think given how more in tune Israelis are with the news, what they've been hearing from Hamas and Israeli officials throughout the past year, as opposed to, I think, people abroad who are a little bit less in tune and a little bit less updated and familiar with the details, that are maybe more surprised at what might be happening on Thursday. But I don't think it shifts the dynamic, and I think that you will have the people who are more likely to call for revenge, depending on how the results we see on Thursday. But in general, I think you still see a very clear majority of the public that wants to move forward with this deal. It's not overwhelming, but it's about 60 to 70%, depending on the poll, that wants to get this phase done and even move into phase 2, regardless of whether that means ending the war or not. I don't think necessarily that, despite that the massive symbolism, and I think it even leads lots of people to double down and talk about the importance of getting as many hostages out as alive. I think, but that's what I've noticed from hostage families, regardless of those who are coming back alive or those who have been found to be no longer alive, is that those families are adamant about trying to push forward with this deal. There doesn't seem to be, obviously there's a small minority who have a different approach, but the vast majority of those families are using whatever the fate of their loved ones, regardless of what it is, to continue fighting for the release of others through this deal.
We'll go to a short break. And we're back. Former White House Mideast czar Brett McGurk last week penned his first op-ed since leaving the government, taking the opportunity to defend the Biden administration's handling of the hostage negotiations and insisting that Hamas was consistently the obstacle to an agreement. I'm going to quote freely here. "We have been criticized for failing to adequately pressure Israel to end the war in Gaza, a war that Hamas itself started on October 7th, 2023. But throughout the ceasefire negotiations, Hamas consistently held back on a commitment to release hostages and aimed to ensure it remained in power after the war ends." So, Jacob, you have been covering the back and forth and the allegations that it's Israel's fault, that it's Hamas's fault, that it's who knows, Qatar's fault throughout the past 18 months almost. And I just wonder, when you were reading the McGurk op-ed, were you surprised in any way that he was so blatantly shifting the focus back on Hamas?
I have to say I was not. Brett was oftentimes the senior administration official that was on briefings that the Biden administration was doing, who was saying a lot of these points and making this broader argument that it was the U.S. actually support for Israel and Israel's military pressure on Hamas as a result that led to the deal that we saw in January. It wasn't about Netanyahu caving. There was this unique commonality that for once you had with Biden people and with Netanyahu folks, who a lot of times were at odds on this issue, were very much rejecting this notion that it was Trump that came in and pushed the deal across the finish line by pressuring Netanyahu. That was an approach that they do not agree with. And you see actually Prime Minister Netanyahu actually retweet Brett McGurk's op-ed. So you clearly see they're in lockstep on this, and I think Netanyahu feels like it vindicates him from all this criticism about maybe being seen as the obstacle. It was noteworthy that I spoke with one American hostage family after the article came out, and they were quite frustrated with McGurk for the article, arguing that they felt that he shouldn't be vindicated. Netanyahu, while Hamas, of course, was an obstacle for much of the time, they felt that there were other times where Netanyahu did drag his feet and make a deal harder to achieve because of the political considerations he was dealing with. I think we're always going to have this two sides of the story here. I think there are legitimate arguments that both sides can make, but I think at the end of the day that we're still going to have this argument. I don't think this puts the issue to bed. One thing that I thought was interesting from the article where Brett talks about this, and it used to be on background, and now we're knowing it's him publicly who's saying it, but basically this example about July. When early July, Hamas comes back and responds to the Biden proposal, with the three phases that we're now trying to go through. And Hamas basically gives a response that's largely accepting it, but still issues all these different sorts of conditions that make it harder to actually get to the finish line. And at this time, the general, if you asked other mediators, I spoke to Qatari and Egyptian officials and even Israeli negotiators who said that at this point, Netanyahu could have gotten a deal if he wanted to, and he refused. And I spoke with another very senior U.S. Biden administration official more recently, arguably even more senior than Brett, who similarly said that really that Hamas was the main obstacle throughout the whole process. But he does agree on this one issue about July, where he felt that maybe it would have been possible had we pushed Israel harder and we came down on them like a ton of bricks, that maybe we could have gotten a deal. But he says, if you recall, what else was happening in July was when President Biden was trying to figure out whether or not he was going to be running again for president, and ultimately decided to bow out. And at that specific point in time where maybe we could have pressured Netanyahu, he says, we were a little bit distracted and it wasn't realistic for us to maybe push this major play against Israel at that specific time. It also made me remember about Yoav Gallant, who also takes a slightly different approach. And he says that there was this shift around July, August in the U.S., and he felt it was because of the elections, similar to what Sullivan was saying, but more broadly that ahead of an election, it was very difficult for the U.S. to come out and say Israel's to blame for the hostage talks over Hamas, a terrorist organization that would have exposed them to lots of criticism from the Republican Party. And then even after the election was over, the feeling was that the Gallant talked about in his recent interview that it became about having a legacy and not wanting to flip-flop after calling out Israel to switch back to Hamas would not make it easy to sustain a strong legacy. The last thing I just wanted to say was that you had an interesting article come out from, it was a blog post, I guess, from Ilan Goldenberg yesterday, who is a very senior official in the Biden and Harris administration. And he talks about also that Hamas was this main obstacle for much of the time. But he also says that it wasn't really July that maybe we could have pushed on Netanyahu, but actually maybe in the end of 2023. And he says that what was happening in the end of 23, just a few months into the war, just shortly after we had the first hostage deal, we had a point where Biden's popularity was actually at the ceiling in Israel. He was very popular after his visit to Israel and the support he was giving, the military support, the moral and diplomatic support. At the same time, Netanyahu's popularity was at the floor. And he was still seen as very much the one who's responsible. Polling, he was way below Benny Gantz at this point. And it had already at this point, also, you had Israel massively weaken Hamas on the battlefield. And even Israeli officials at that point already were saying Hamas could not carry out another October 7th attack. And at that point, he says, maybe we should have taken the different approach of this two paths speech that I talked a little bit about. I did a report about that they thought about doing it in May. And Ilan argues it's probably made more sense to do it then when Biden's popularity was much stronger, and basically put forward to Israel the options of what you have in front of you. One path is to continue with the war and maybe basically get to the same place where we end up being today. And another path is taking a ceasefire earlier on, saving lots of lives, including hostages, and getting to a path towards normalization with Saudi Arabia, with the Arab states helping out in Gaza. It obviously requires Israel to involve the PA, something it's still not willing to do. But he felt that maybe at that point in late 2023, early 2024, there was maybe a window to take a different approach with the Israeli, maybe come down hard. It did risk the opportunity for Israel to just simply say no, and then the U.S. loses all of its leverage. But he thinks that we still would have ended up where we are today, a year later, where eventually a ceasefire being reached. So it was an interesting take that all these different, there's Ilan Goldenberg's take and Yoav Gallant's take, and now we have McGurk. There's all these different ways to look at how the U.S. maybe should have played. I think there's going to be a lot more time, and we're seeing it already just in a few months of all these different reflections happening from Biden officials about how they could have maybe done things differently or stand by exactly how they did, which is what McGurk is doing in his op-ed.
And of course, hindsight is 2020, obviously, Jacob. None of this is happening in a vacuum. And Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is expected to travel to Riyadh tomorrow, according to Reuters, where he is due to discuss an Arab plan for Gaza that may include up to $20 billion from the region for reconstruction. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar are reportedly set to review and discuss the Arab plan before it is presented at a scheduled Arab summit that is slated to take place in Cairo on March 4th. Now, Israel's envoy to the United States has accused Egypt's president of violating the U.S. brokered peace deal between Jerusalem and Cairo, profiting from the desperation of Palestinians seeking to flee the Gaza Strip and operating to benefit Hamas. So Ambassador Yechiel Leiter made these allegations during a Zoom meeting on January 28th with the executives of major American Jewish organizations. And a recording of that was obtained by you, Jacob. So, Jacob, tell us what you heard in this recording.
Yeah, so it was quite a bit of accusations lobbed at Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, but I think the most important ones were focused on Egypt because these were some things that had never been lobbed publicly at this point by a senior Israeli official. There were some murmurings of frustrations of what Leiter ends up talking about, but this was the first time we're hearing it come to light. And he first argues that Egypt is violating the peace treaty with Israel by amassing lots of troops and equipment and tanks on Israel's or the near the Philadelphia corridor, that border strip between Egypt and Gaza, and also along the Israeli border as well. And he says the only reason you do this is for an offensive maneuver against theoretically Israel. And so a very salacious accusation, I guess you could say. There's been some footage to back up what he's saying. Some of the footage has been found to be actually old from different times and not necessarily from where we might necessarily from the border. But still, this has been something that the security establishment, I understand, has been increasingly concerned about. And now Leiter's bringing it to light. And then you had him also accuse Sisi and his family of profiting off of the suffering of Gazans by charging them so much money to leave. Like tens of thousands of dollars are required, and only 100,000 roughly Palestinians from Gaza have been able to leave because of these exorbitant fees. And then he also claims that Sisi's playing both sides regarding Hamas and not really coming down necessarily hard enough because for his own personal considerations, he didn't really elaborate on that point. But three very, very far-reaching accusations that my understanding led to a very angry response from Cairo, and it raised the issue with its channels privately with Israel. It was surprised that Leiter chose to make this issue public, especially right now in this very sensitive time during the hostage negotiations. But Leiter says that we're done kind of sucking it up and not talking about this. We're going to really be putting this issue to the fore. Interestingly, though, once the story did come public, the Conference of Presidents published the recording of this that I'd gotten a hold of. And then they took it down, my understanding, because actually I think the Israeli embassy didn't like how public it got, because this really did get a lot of play in Arabic media in particular. And I think they maybe want to tone down the tensions a little bit, given how angry Egypt has been in response to this.
Now, a listener wrote in this week that in Sunday's episode with respect to phase 2 of the negotiations, Times of Israel editor David Horowitz mentioned that the U.S. has leverage over Qatar as it has a military base there. And he wrote that it's the first time he's hearing of this, but it makes him wonder even more why Trump doesn't pressure Qatar to take in Palestinians. So this topic of Qatar and, again, an allegation against Qatar came up during the same conversation Leiter held with Jewish leaders. So in this case, he was talking about Qatar, and he was saying, essentially, I'm going to quote here, "We have to start talking about Qatar, the game that they're playing, buying everybody out and then buying quiet and buying toleration for their support of terror is just not tenable. We have to call their bluff and say, yes, you're supporting faculties and universities around the country. You're also supporting terror organizations. That doesn't hold water. The first thing is to speak truth to their financial power. So this kind of aligns with what you were saying just now and also with the Trump administration's approach. So tie this together for us.
Okay, so you mentioned, first of all, this base in Qatar, and I think you could argue that actually the U.S. base, the leverage goes both ways, that the U.S. wants this massive base in Qatar because it's important to be able to have these assets in the Middle East. So the U.S. needs Qatar in some regards, but also Qatar relies on the U.S. for, I think, maintaining its legitimacy and also its ability to continue trying to play a mediator role. It relies on the U.S. for its to back it up in playing that role as it has both with the Biden administration and with the Trump administration. You're already seeing President Trump in a press conference with Netanyahu a couple weeks ago. He talks about that Qatar is playing a very effective role. And you had this comment from Yechiel Leiter where he says, we're done sucking it up regarding Qatar and that we now need to tell the truth. I just think it's noteworthy when I pushed an Israeli official on this and I said, but the U.S. and Israel are the ones that asked Qatar to host Hamas. They're the ones that asked Qatar to pay for all these funds in Gaza that allowed Hamas to then use its own funding for terror activities instead of for the welfare of those in Gaza. So, and the response I got was like, well, yes, that's true. And then it's compounded if you want to call it hypocrisy, but also the questionability about whether or not this is a legitimate argument is that you have one of Netanyahu's aides now under investigation for having worked for Qatar, doing PR for Qatar while he's maybe not officially working for Netanyahu, but definitely behind the scenes. Eli Feldstein, he's been in the headlines a lot for the now he's under indictment and all this other investigations on a separate issue. But clearly the Israeli-Qatar relationship is very complex, and I don't think it's as black and white as Qatar is just two-timing us when Israel has no agency in this relationship. The other thing I will say though, to I guess the credit of Leiter is that there is the better argument I think you can focus on is Al Jazeera, and you have seen Israel take real hard actions against Al Jazeera, and you're also seeing, interestingly, the Palestinian Authority also try to limit their operations in the West Bank, and that's where I think you can say they're playing a real poisonous role by allowing this network to just air whatever it wants and very clearly be a microphone for Hamas and just to parrot whatever they say without any critical thinking.
And just finish up by telling us what is the tie between Al Jazeera and Qatar, just to spell it out here.
Yeah, Al Jazeera, it's a state-owned Qatari outlet. Obviously, Qatari officials will say we don't tell them what to publish, but there's clearly limits to what they can. You don't see them publishing criticism against Qatar. I think they're more they avoid any sort of criticism regarding Hamas a lot of the time, and also their coverage of Iran is a bit less objective, I guess you could say, than it is on other subjects, and that is something that I think has played a massive role in the way that the Arab world and the broader world understands this war has been through the lens of Al Jazeera, and I think it's possible we could have a bit of a different understanding of how this war has played out if Al Jazeera didn't play the role it has as really being just a mouthpiece for Hamas.
Jacob, thank you as usual for all of these updates and insights. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I understand I'm going to see you in person soon. Is that right?
Yes, I'll be on my way in a few hours, heading to Israel, so that should be fun.
Excellent. I'll give you a big hug then. So thank you so much for listening to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.